The book of Daniel is probably one of the most familiar of the Old Testament prophets. He rivals with Isaiah as far as familiarity and love for the book. And it makes sense. If you think about it, Daniel, for many of you, you've probably heard the stories of Daniel from early on. In fact, we teach it in our Sunday school classes. Kids learn these stories early on. But there's a lot more to Daniel than just a few stories. And as we see, we're going to see how God moves in the nations and people in miraculous ways in order to ultimately accomplish his purposes. The book has some very familiar sayings. In fact, if you look at pictures, you know the stories of Nebuchadnezzar and the statue. You know about Daniel's visions of these beasts, and they're insane when you start trying to picture them. But even we know stories like the fiery furnace. But if you notice, even in our culture, we have colloquial or familiar sayings that actually come from the book of Daniel. Think about it. You talk to somebody, you say, they're going into the lion's den, or they've been cast into the lion's den. We use that phrase to highlight that concept or idea. There's danger, there's imminent danger, or it's going to be an extremely difficult situation for them. And so we use that phrase. Or even, what about this phrase? The handwriting on the wall. It's there. You can see the handwriting on the wall. You know your job is downsizing, and you can see that the handwriting on the wall says you're probably going to get laid off. Or you can look and say, I knew this was going to happen. The handwriting was on the wall. Again, that's from Daniel, from chapter 5. And so we have these dynamics, these phrases that come directly from the book of Daniel. Daniel is going to present this majestic sweep of history. He's not looking just at one little aspect. He's looking at the worldwide picture of what God is doing. He's going to give you a semi-detailed outline of God's plan. And God's going to reveal enough, but withhold some too. Learn that God gives us these prophetic books to inform us and to help us know about the future, and to instruct us, though, to live in this present life. The book of Daniel, perhaps more than any other book in the Old Testament, it sobers us, and yet grounds us to God's eternal perspective, to his perspective on human events, his perspective on heavenly events. And as we tune into the book of Daniel, we see a little bit of what God's doing. So let's look at the book of Daniel today, and let's understand a little bit more, so that as we dive in, we can say, okay, we know what God is doing a little bit. Actually, a little bit more than a little bit. We can know a good amount. So the title of the book of Daniel, obviously, it's going to come from the book, the main character, Daniel. It's sometimes referred to as the Apocalypse of the Old Testament. We'll get to that term in a second, because sometimes we think apocalypse and we start thinking movies. Even just in a recent Lego movie 2, the one kid was building this post-apocalypse Legoland. So we throw this term apocalypse around. So then to apply it to a Bible book, it's a little different. But Daniel is often referred to as the Apocalypse of the Old Testament. Daniel's named after the principal human character in the book. His name means God is my judge. Daniel claims to write the book. You can look in chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10. In chapter 12, he says, in verses 4 and 5, he says that obviously that I, Daniel, and that's the phrase that often comes up, is I, Daniel, wrote this. Chapter 12, verses 4 and 5. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, and so it go in there. But what's interesting is that's God looking to Daniel and saying, Daniel, seal it up. What you've been writing, what you've been doing, put it together. So God is even understanding that. And even from chapter 7 on, Daniel uses this first person singular I. So it's a first-hand account. He is writing what he has seen, what he knows. And the Jewish writers, and even Christ later on in Matthew 24, verse 15, he highlights the fact that the book is ascribed to Daniel the prophet. Yes, now what do we know about this man Daniel? We know a little bit about him. We don't know a ton. Now, the book of Daniel is not written to be his autobiography. It's going to highlight how God used Daniel, and it's going to highlight what God does through Daniel. It's going to highlight his ministry, but it's not written as an autobiography to say, let me tell you everything about Daniel did. And it doesn't even do it in a chronological order, because you're going to see that in chapter, if you go to chapter 5, you're going to have the feast of Belshazzar, who is a Babylonian king. And then by the end of chapter 5, verse 30, it's going to say, the same night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, or the Babylonian king, he's slain, and Darius the Mede, and there's going to be a transition of power between Babylon and Medo-Persia. And right there at 5 verse 31, chapter 5 verse 31. Well, then if you go a little bit later on in the book, go down to chapter 7, it says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So Daniel is now writing in chapter 7 about something that happened previous to chapter 5, the end of chapter 5. So it's not, Daniel's, again, not written chronologically. There's a thematic flow to it, and we'll talk about that later when we get to the outlines and language and things like that. But Daniel's not meant to be looked at and say, here's the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. He's writing with a purpose, with an intent. He's driving us to understand there's some practical points for present day living in the book of Daniel. And Daniel's intentionally writing in a certain way. The man Daniel, we know this. It seems that he comes from a Jewish noble family from Judea. He was taken away in 605 by Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar goes down, defeats Egypt, and he's going to start making his way back through. On his way back through Jerusalem, he's going to take the king, Jehoiakim. He's going to take Daniel. He's going to take his friends, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, or better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's going to take them to Jerusalem, Babylon, along with a number of other individuals during that time. But it's not the full exile of the Jews at that point. Daniel seems to, according to chapter 1, verse 4, you look, he had no defect. He was well put together, no blemishes. He was good looking. He showed intelligence. He was gifted in wisdom and discernment. How they understood all this, don't know if it was just by instant interviews or if they just walked through and said, you seem like a smart, good-looking guy, come with me. So we know I wouldn't have been chosen to go, but that's okay. They look and they say, here, you're coming with. They probably did some profiling, but they weren't in a culture where that really mattered. The king says, find me these people. Look at what they were to do, because this plays out later on. It's important. The middle of verse 4, having the knowledge, who had the ability for what? Serving in the king's court. Their intention was to serve, to minister to the king. And that's what they were supposed to do. So that's what Daniel's going to be doing. Daniel's also had his name changed. If you go down to verse number 7 of chapter 1, he's going to have his name changed to Belteshazzar. What they're trying to do is basically change, reprogram, if you would, these individuals. And it's interesting to me to know that there were more than just 4 young men taken. There was more than Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego taken. A lot of other Jewish young men taken at this point. And yet we only hear of these 4 faithful. Faithfulness is key. We hear about what they've done and how they lived. And so God is going to bless them through this time. And Daniel's going to rise up through the government. He's going to be this official, and he's going to be used also as a prophet of God. Although what's interesting is he's never officially given that title or the holy office of prophet until the New Testament. The Old Testament writers, he doesn't refer to himself as a prophet. He doesn't use the term that's used for prophet. He's called a seer. He's called a wise individual, like a magi, but he's not called the prophet. And because of that, and because of how he ministered as well, even in the Jewish canon, the way they put together the books in the Old Testament, he was not initially the book of Daniel was not initially put with the prophets. It was put with the other writings, like Psalms and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the different writings. And so there was even a separation initially seen because it's a different type of literature. It's still prophetic, don't get me wrong, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. Daniel is one of the few well-known Bible characters about who nothing negative is said. It's never written anything negative about this individual. You can go through and look at other main Bible characters, and there's always something. But not Daniel. Daniel was characterized by faith, by prayer, by courage, by consistency, lack of compromise. You can go through the list, and you might look at Daniel and go, I could never be like this guy. He's too perfect. God doesn't call you to be Daniel. God calls you to be you, but he does call us to live a life that is exemplary to glorifying God and serving him and being faithful to him and being individuals of prayer and faith and courage as we go forward in life. It's really interesting to me how much the book of Daniel applies to life right now, to the difficulties we face, and yet how do we live? How do we live in this world? How do we live when our coworkers are just vile? How do we live when our boss wants us to compromise our ethics? So just a little side note to be thinking about as we go through. Book of Daniel is very relevant. Very relevant. And by the way, that quote right there, just so you know, it is not by Johnny Appleseed. And I'm not going to take the time to edit it out of the video because that'll take longer than me just saying, I forgot to erase that. It's a quote by John MacArthur, not Johnny Appleseed. Sorry about that. Just saw that. Let's talk about the dating. I'm gonna have to not get the giggle fits now because I'm just gonna keep laughing at Johnny Appleseed. Let's talk about when the book was written. Daniel claimed to write the book. We know that. We know that he was a man of character. The book and the events take place starting in 605. Again, we throw numbers around a lot, but the reason that I try to give you these numbers is to help you put the Bible in the perspective of when it is and what's happening in the world. And so if you've been with us for any number of weeks, you'll notice that we'll start here and we'll get all the way to here, and then all of a sudden the next book is going to go back to here and go to here, and then the next book is going to go all the way back to here, and then it's going to come back. So it's just nice to have the dates to be able to look and to say, okay, this is what is happening and when it is happening. So in 605, remember that's the first time Nebuchadnezzar is going to come through. He's going to conquer Jerusalem for the first part, sort of, but he's going to take Daniel and his friends, he's going to take them to Babylon. So if you go to chapter 1 of the book of Daniel, that's going to happen in verse 1:1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord, what does he do? Look at the next verse. This is super important. These words highlight. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands. Who's involved in the destruction of Jerusalem? It's Nebuchadnezzar, yes. But ultimately, God is the one moving. God is the one working to allow this. So then you're going to have, the king is going to appoint them to go through this testing. Remember? He's going to look and he's going to say, I want them to provide. So verse 5, the king appointed for them a daily ration for the king's choice, so that they would be tested, they would be educated for 3 years. At the end of the personal service, they're going to be evaluated. This happened in the first year that they're brought over. So 604, chapter 1, Daniel's going to be tested. And then by the time you get to chapter 2, okay, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, it's going to be 603. Some say 602, depending on the dating, if they're using Babylonian dating or Jewish dating. But 603, 602, right in there, Nebuchadnezzar's going to have his dream. Notice who isn't in Babylon yet. All this has already taken place, in Ezekiel is still in Judea. He's still down there. Because it's not until 597 that Ezekiel, who we just spent 2 weeks studying, is only going to be brought in 597 to Babylon. So the things happening with Daniel in the first part are already happening. And Daniel's already ascending to leadership in Babylon, even before Ezekiel finds his way to Babylon. Then you're going to have 586, Jerusalem's going to fall, the destruction. And then in chapter 10, of Daniel, verse 1, you're going to see that it's at this point in 536 that Daniel, you're going to hear about that Cyrus, the king of Persia, is going to decree that there is going to, in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel. That's the last dating we have in the book is 536, though we know it goes on a little bit and we beyond that date. But we can look and say, okay, we know this much. For about 70 years, Daniel's going to minister. Most commentators will put the writing of the book of Daniel in the last 10 years or so of Daniel's life, his last decade. So probably written between 545 to 530, somewhere in there, during that time period. And so Daniel's going to write during those times, and it's just that gives us the beginning of that historical background. The historical background is Babylonian exile. Daniel is in Babylon. Not all the Jews are to Babylon yet. There's still some. There's still hope that maybe there'll be some repentance, but we know that that's not going to happen. So everything in the book of Daniel is Babylonian exile, and then it transitions to Persian exile. Okay? Daniel ministers in the palace. Unlike Ezekiel, Daniel is going to minister in the palace. Everything is very similar to the background of Ezekiel. You can go back and read Ezekiel's background and get the understanding. But the differences are important to understand. Daniel's going to minister in the palace. Ezekiel ministers to the Jews in exile. And that doesn't mean that Daniel's writings aren't for the Jews. They are very much for the Jews during that time and to encourage them and to help. But his ministry is not to those people every day. His ministry is every day in the government, working for the government and the king. The world power is going to shift in the middle of the book. We mentioned it already in chapter 5, verse 31 and 32, where the transition happens from Belshazzar, king of Babylon, in the middle of the night. Darius the Mede is going to come in. He's going to conquer. He's going to sneak under the walls and through the canals of the city while the party's going on and while everybody's starting to go to sleep. And they're going to decimate and take out Babylon. And the Babylonian Empire is going to begin to crumble at that point, and the Persians take over. So there's a change, and you'll see that phrase Medo-Persia. It was a two-nation confederacy, the Medes and the Persians. And the Persians were always stronger than the Medes, and we'll see that come out later on in the prophecies. But they were an alliance together. And so that changes, the control changes of who's in power. The world leaders are different. It's important to note and to just write down and to remember who's who. Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. And if you're going to be like me, you're going to get Belteshazzar and Belshazzar mixed up. Belshazzar is the king. Belteshazzar is Daniel. You don't see Belteshazzar name come up very often, but it is. So just make that mental note. Make that difference between Belshazzar and Belteshazzar. Belshazzar is the king. So those are the Babylonian rulers highlighted in the book of Daniel. There are other Babylonian rulers. There's Nabopolassar, who is Nebuchadnezzar's dad. You have Nabonidus, who was a co-regent, a co-ruler with Belshazzar. So there's other individuals, other brothers and siblings who are involved. But the two that are highlighted in this book, and there's a reason that they're highlighted. One, Nebuchadnezzar is the powerful. He is the main guy. But there's another reason, as we'll look at later, maybe in the next video, why Belshazzar is highlighted as well. And then for the Persian rulers, you have Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian. And those are going to be the two big guys. And they're important. Darius is going to be highlighted because he's going to be the king involved with the lion's den. Cyrus is going to be highlighted, and Cyrus is extremely important because Cyrus is the one who's sympathetic to the Jewish cause, the plight, and he's going to be the one who decrees to say, yes, go back. Go back to your land and begin to resettle, to build your temple, to build your walls, to build your city. And they're going to be making decrees between Cyrus and then later on Artaxerxes, who is a follower of a descendant of Cyrus, going to reemphasize those decrees and allow those things to happen. So Cyrus and Darius, the Persian ruler, is very important to understand in the book. So keep your four kings. And what's interesting is Daniel ministers through all four of those kings. He has a long life and a long life of ministry. 70 years of ministry and in servitude, both in government and prophetically. It's interesting, I always like to highlight, I have a different role in my life than many of you. The ministry I've been called to is a vocational ministry of preaching and teaching, but that doesn't mean that your life and ministry of what God has called you to is any less important. This ministry of preaching is super important, and I pray for more young men to move in that direction, and God to use maybe some of the teens or some of the young adults, or even maybe somebody for a second career to go into ministry and to preach and to teach as God wants them to. But Daniel is not first and foremost a prophet. He is an advisor in a government position. Similar to Nehemiah, who's in a government position. They're in a pagan government position. And what are they able to do? Faithfully minister for God. We cannot look and say, well, my workplace is too vile. I can't stand for God. I might lose my job. Look at the example of these men through this book. They were leaders, and they understood what happens. Think about that as we go through. I'm going to back the train up. I gave you a little nugget there, but I don't want to get to my final points before we get to the final points. I have another Johnny Appleseed quote. That's two of them in this one. Let's go. Daniel spans about 75 years, as we said. Another quote by Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed is a great theologian in Daniel. God gave us prophetic books to inform us about the future and to instruct us about the present. That's actually by a gentleman called Tremper Longman. He writes, Studying the Bible with Heart and Mind is where that quote is from. But God gave us prophetic books to inform us about the future and to instruct us about the present. What's interesting is the book of Daniel, you have 6 chapters of history, of this is what's happening, this is how God's working, this is what God's doing in Daniel's life, and how God is shaping and working. How do we practically live in trials? How do we practically live when we're asked to do something that is not biblical? How do we practically live when we are told that this is what you're going to do and it truly violates what God has said? How do we handle it? What do? We learn about it. What does the Bible say about praying on a consistent basis? We learn about that from Daniel. And so the book of Daniel highlights first that present living with tomorrow in mind. So as we look, the term that comes up, and I've referred to it a couple times, as we go into this idea of literature and interpretation. How do we understand the Word of God, especially the book of Daniel? It's confusing, but it's not impossible. You can study this and you can understand it. The book is here. It's a fine-tuned type of prophecy. It is prophecy. But it's like you have prophecy, and then you're going to have this subset group, this smaller group. You're going to have dogs, and then you're going to have poodles. All poodles are dogs, but not all dogs are poodles. Okay, same thing as here. You have prophecy, you have apocalyptic literature. All apocalyptic literature is prophetic. Biblical apocalyptic literature is prophetic. But not all prophecy is apocalyptic literature. So what is apocalypse? The idea. It comes from this idea to uncover, to lift or take out what's been hidden. It's like, surprise, here it is. Or pulling back the curtains and giving you that glimpse in. You don't see everything, you don't fully understand everything, but you're allowed to have that glimpse into it. And so Daniel has had the veil pulled back on world history, on the events. God even uses a pagan king's dream to help reveal what he's going to do in the future. And so as we look at this idea of apocalyptic literature goes far beyond the next few years. Prophecy could look and say, okay, it's going to happen in the next few years. It's going to, you're going to have victory over this king when this happens, or that'll happen, or even the next few centuries. But apocalyptic literature looks to the end of history, the end of the world as we know it. It's there. Apocalyptic literature relies heavily upon visions which reveal and conceal. Notice that. God's intention in giving us all of this is not for us to be able to understand every single thing right away. Now, through study, we can get a very good, clear picture. But his goal was not to say, I want you to understand what the hair on the beast means, or you can dig too far. You can get into numerology and say, well, what about this number, and this is all going to happen. And many of us have been there. You remember back to 2000, and everybody's predicting the end of the world, or, I remember Pastor, when he does his End Time series, talking about, guys who predict like 2008 reasons that the Lord is coming back in 2008, and then it doesn't happen. So the next year was 2009 reasons, and they use all these numerologies and reasonings. We don't know the end. God doesn't allow us to know all there is to know about the end of the world. Even the Son of Man does not know the hour that God has appointed. So it's not the goal of Daniel. Don't get so into the weeds that you miss some of the big picture. Get into the weeds, it's fun. But don't get lost in there. Take a step back and say, what is the big picture? Because he's going to reveal things through these prophecies and visions, and yet some of it's not going to be completely understood until the end time. Apocalyptic literature is very symbolic and very mysterious. We can understand it when we understand what the symbolism meant. We understand, like, you have this beast coming out of the sea, and the sea being often represented about humanity, and especially about those nations that were against Israel. And so think about it. The beast comes out of the sea. It has multiple heads. And in the middle of that, there comes a man riding on a horse and through the sky. And you're looking and saying, what in the world is going on here? It's intended. It's apocalyptic. It's very symbolic, very mysterious. Because of this, apocalyptic literature often requires interpretation from a heavenly mediator. Do you remember when Daniel gets to, I think it's chapter 9. I just blinked. Let me look at my notes here. We'll come back to it. I think it's the end of chapter 9, when he doesn't understand, and so the angel comes and he's going to be a mediator for him. He's going to help him to understand it. Even with Daniel, he needs to go to God and say, God, help me to understand this dream. He can't just say, oh, this is what it means. These are intense visions that take place. Apocalyptic literature in the Bible includes Daniel, Revelation. Those are the two big ones, Zechariah and Ezekiel. Now, some will say parts of Isaiah as well, but these ones are the four main recognized ones, especially the last half of Ezekiel, where you deal with the kingdom. But it's really not dealing with the end. That's more the restructuring of the New Jerusalem, the temple. So even some people shy away from the Ezekiel, but Daniel and Revelation, for sure, Zechariah, they are apocalyptic. They are looking to the end times, and this is what's going to happen. Daniel is foundational to Revelation, very important to understand both together as you go through. What about Daniel's perspective? Again, he's not the ministering prophet every day to the people. What is his perspective? The book considers the secular world in light of God's ultimate purpose. And the book describes the final coming kingdom. Think about what's happening constantly through the book. Nebuchadnezzar's king, the statue, there's going to be all these kingdoms that are going to come. There's going to be this stone that's hewn out, and it's going to be crushed, and it's going to crush and cause all the other kingdoms to fall. We later on had these beasts that are going to come and represent these kingdoms, but there's going to be this one. Then you get to later on in the prophecies, you're going to get the kingdoms of the ram and the goat, and there's this constant movement of prideful, strong, powerful kingdoms that are going to constantly exalt themselves against God and against humanity to increase their power. But in the end, there is this kingdom that is going to come. It is going to be final. The stone, the Son of Man, the one who is going to sit at the right hand of the Father, that Christ is going to come. His kingdom is going to be established forever, and it's going to destroy all these other proud nations, these other kingdoms. This book is constantly, it doesn't look back to just, all right, what's happening with Judah or Israel, the kingdoms there. It looks to the world nations, the pagan nations that are there. And I think it highlights an important fact too, that God is concerned and God is working in other nations, not just in the Jewish nations. He wants to see these people follow and humble themselves before God. They're given those opportunities to humble themselves. So we can't dismiss other nations. So he highlights that. There is no mention. This is an interesting dynamic. His perspective is not to call people back to God. He wants the people to follow God faithfully. He looks, the book of Daniel is looking and saying, be faithful in life, be faithful in trials, be faithful in difficult times. He doesn't say repent. He doesn't look and say, hey, you're not being covenantly faithful. He doesn't even bring up the idea of the covenant and being faithful to the covenant or unfaithfulness to the covenant. Whereas remember, Ezekiel is going to say, hey, remember the reason we're here? Remember, he lays it out like that lawyer, and he says, your covenant unfaithfulness, Jews, that is why. And God's going to restore a new covenant. He's going to bring us back. He's going to give us that tender heart. He's going to write on our hearts. Daniel doesn't deal with that. Daniel looks and says, be faithful in trials, be faithful in difficulty, pray, be consistent. Live your life in the location, in the situation God has given you. Be content with where you're at and faithfully minister. That's Daniel. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're going to be faithful to God. They're going to be faithful to others. There's some theological themes that come up in the book. And very, very important as we go through. The book looks at the pride and arrogance of humanity, especially its leaders. Go with me over to chapter 3. Let's do chapter 2 and 3 as a quick overview for a moment. Remember that God has granted Nebuchadnezzar to be able to take Judah, chapter 1. God grants Daniel favor in chapter 1. You get to chapter 2 and we get this great image. Remember in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And the only person who is able to interpret it is Daniel. And Daniel comes and he says, that all this is going to happen. There's a really interesting dynamic that occurs here. Remember what Nebuchadnezzar says to the wise men, you're going to tell me the dream. And he says, not only are you going to tell me the dream, but you're going to tell me the interpretation. And if you can't, what's going to happen? You're going to be put to death. And they're all like, this is impossible. And he gets enraged more. And he's like, all right. He looks at his captain of the guard, Arrogance, and he says, all right, start killing them. So all of a sudden, verse 12, chapter 2, verse 12. Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. And who's in this group? And they look for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because they were in this group of wise men. They were in this group of satraps and individuals who are going to be given advice to the king. And so when Daniel replies, he goes and says, Arrogance, can I go to the king and ask for a stay for a second so that I can bring the answer to him? And so the king allows it, they allow it. So Daniel went in and requested, verse 16, of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. He doesn't go in and say, this isn't fair. You can't do this. Your policies are all wrong. He goes to the king. He says, here's my plan. This is what I'd like to do. Will you give me a few days or give me some time? We don't know exactly how much, maybe 24 hours that he's given to get this interpretation. So the king is going to grant that to him. So what happens? Verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house, informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter. in order that they might request compassion from God, the God of heaven, concerning this mystery. Who do most people would they have requested mercy from? The king. Nebuchadnezzar, King, be merciful to us. Don't kill us. We'll do our best for you, whatever you want. He goes to the high king. He goes to the king of heaven. He says, we're going to request compassion from God. And it's asking him, what they're going to do is they're going to ask so that they might not be destroyed, as well as the rest of the wise men. It's an interesting prayer there. Lord, don't give me COVID. Lord, keep my family safe. I guess if somebody else gets it, no big deal, but I just don't not my family. Daniel's prayer, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's prayer, was for the other wise men as well, for their safety, for their concern. So they pray, and then notice what happens. When this was brought out to me in seminary by my professor, it really impacted me. I mean, I remember to this day when he said that in our Daniel class. All these people, the wise men all around, are either being slaughtered at this point, or their heads are they're lining up outside with their head on the chopping block, literally, not even proverbial, ready to be killed, waiting for the axe to come down from the king. And Daniel and his three friends pray to God, and then what do they do? Look at the next verse. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. It was in a dream while he was sleeping. Which meant they did what? They trusted in God so much that God was going to reveal it, that God would protect them, or if they weren't going to be protected, that the other end, then that's what God wanted. They trusted so much in God's sovereign control of everything that was happening. They prayed and went to sleep. I have to wonder, how many times in my life, in your life, even right now, life is chaotic, it is full of turmoil, and we stress, and we worry to the point that we can't sleep, to the point that it is making us sick. And we have to take a step back and say, wait, if I believe that God is in control, that he has allowed things to happen, I'm going to trust that he has his best in store for me. Daniel and his friends were trusting the goodness of God, that God was going to care for them, and if God did not care for them, and he allowed them to die, then that was what God had for them. They had a very high view of God. In fact, it's going to come out later, we'll see next week, in the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it's not just a fatalism of, oh, whatever. They say that if God is going to take care of us and deliver us, then that's to God. And if not, they understood what the consequences were, but they were going to do what was right. This book deals with the pride and arrogance of humanity. And here we have this arrogant king saying, this is what you're going to do, and if not, I'm going to kill you. And you have the humility of these men going before God and trusting in God to say, you'll deliver us. We know that they receive the answer. They go, and God uses that to exalt Daniel. And not only does it exalt Daniel, but by the end of chapter 2, verse 49, that Daniel requests the king that he appoint Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over other administrations, so they're exalted as well. And what's interesting in how it all flows in the book, the rise of Daniel, the king Nebuchadnezzar is just heard about this great statue. He's the statue, the head of gold, and his pride is even swelling more. Daniel is raised, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are now raised to a position of authority. And you get to chapter 3, and Nebuchadnezzar, in his pride and his arrogance, is going to build a statue. Whether the statue is a resemblance of maybe what he thought he saw in the dream, or if it is a resemblance of him, but it's overlaid with gold, it's big, people see it, and they're to bow down to it. When you read through chapter 3 sometime, notice how much it is based around Nebuchadnezzar. Here's what I mean, in our few moments as we wrap up. We look at this book, and you see that there is this sovereignty of God illustrated throughout, but you have the pride of man. God has given this. God has given the nations. Now you get chapter 3. Look what it says. Nebuchadnezzar the king, verse 1. Verse 2, then Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold. Verse 2, then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word. At the end of chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up this decree. Verse 3, Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Down to the end of verse 5, Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. You're going to constantly, end of verse 7, Nebuchadnezzar the king. Verse 9, Nebuchadnezzar the king. Verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and anger. Verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar responds. You're going to see this all the way through Nebuchadnezzar. It is just this constant way of raising up this is all about me. I am Nebuchadnezzar. I'm the head of gold. I'm the great one. The most powerful king ever. And these men won't worship him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego won't bow down and worship the statue. They won't do it. So he heats up the furnace. He throws the men in the furnace. The guy's throwing them into the furnace. They die. But nothing happens with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says in verse 25, Nebuchadnezzar is going to say, Nebuchadnezzar, verse 24, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste and responded to the high officials. He's been doing, and all of a sudden he's like, guys, didn't we put 3 people into the fiery furnace? Why do I see 4 men? And the one looks like a son of God. It's not Nebuchadnezzar saying, oh, look, Jesus Christ is there. He wouldn't have understood who Jesus Christ was. We look back and say, more than likely a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. Maybe an angel there, but Jesus Christ walking through the flames with these men who are faithful to him. And God stands faithfully by those who are faithful to him. And you have, all of a sudden, these men who were low are going to be exalted again. And ultimately, not only they're going to be exalted, but God is going to be glorified through their faithfulness. Nebuchadnezzar is going to sort of be humbled. He's going to have to eat his words a little bit. He's going to have to let these men out. He's going to say nobody can say anything else against their God. Would be if anything that says anything offensive, they're going to be torn, verse 29, torn limb from limb. And we see that God is exalted because of the faithfulness of these men. And as we look through the book, and as we keep going forward, we see that pride and arrogance are going to be dealt with. We're going to see that it's also going to go into the prophetic sections where pride and arrogance of the Antichrist and others who are going to exalt themselves against God, they will be dealt with. But God blesses the faithful. Be faithful to God. Be in prayer. Great, great things. His sovereignty is illustrated throughout the book over nations, over individuals, over nature. He's going to shut the lion's mouth. He's going to step in and say, you're not going to get burned. I'm in control of when you die, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm going to take care of this. Over future kingdoms, God is sovereign in the affairs of men. And as we wrap up today, thinking about a number of facets in the book of Daniel, just the first 3 chapters. Do I exalt myself against God? Is my pride, is my arrogance so great that I need to just humbly come before him? Do I practice on a consistent basis trust, comfort in him, finding rest in God? Daniel and the men found rest in God. Why? Because they knew God was faithful. They knew God was in control. They knew God had a plan. I don't know what the plan is or even why God is doing and allowing COVID. I have no clue. I don't think we can just instantly jump and say, it's the judgment of God upon America. It's a worldwide pandemic. Sure, there's issues because of sin and God is going to judge. But I don't know why. But I know this. God's in control. This didn't catch him off guard. He's well aware of what's happening. He's well aware of what's... just to be silly, he knows where Kim Jong, whatever his name is, just totally slipped from North Korea. He knows where he is. He knows what's happened to him. Nobody else does. Everybody's wondering, where's the leader of North Korea? God knows. God knows what's happening. God knows all those facets. He's in control. Can I rest in him today? Say, God, I trust you. That whatever comes about, it is good. Because you are good. We live today with tomorrow in mind. Knowing that one day I will see the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. I will bow before him. Let's live our lives today, trusting in him, that he is God, and he is in control of the affairs of men. God knows what you're going through. God knows your life. God knows your struggles. Trust in him. Go to him in prayer and rest in him.